Picture this scene unfolding before your very eyes. You are a Persian spy, meticulously positioned and crouching amidst the jagged rocks high above Thermopylae. The year is 480 BC. Your critical mission: to discreetly assess the fearsome Spartan army that currently stands as an insurmountable barrier in your path. You arrive, fully anticipating the sight of impenetrable iron walls and towering giants furiously sharpening their colossal blades. Yet, what you actually witness is utterly bewildering. Men, stark naked, casually seated on the dusty ground, meticulously combing their long, flowing hair and carefully anointing their skin with oil. You race back to King Xerxes, breathless, to report that the enemy appears to be behaving like a group of women luxuriating at a spa. Xerxes, amused, lets out a hearty laugh, convinced these Greeks are utterly mad. However, standing silently beside him is an exiled Spartan king, a man whose face betrays no amusement. He turns solemnly to the great king and quietly whispers the chilling, unvarnished truth. The Spartans, he explains, do not attend to their grooming out of vanity. Rather, they only meticulously prepare their hair when they are fully aware that their death is imminent. What you observed, he clarifies, was not a leisurely activity. It was, in fact, a solemn funeral rite. Those men, he grimly concludes, have absolutely no intention of surviving the week. Before we delve deeper into these forgotten tales of extraordinary survival and immense suffering, if you find pleasure in uncovering the hidden truths of history, please consider showing your support by hitting that like button and subscribing for more compelling content just like this. And I would genuinely love for you to share in the comments below, letting me know where in the world you're currently listening from. I find it truly remarkable that we are able to explore these ancient narratives together, spanning across different continents and connected through time and space by our shared, insatiable curiosity about the past. The stark truth is, those famed 300 men were never, under any circumstances, supposed to have been there. In Sparta, it was the sacred season of the Carnea, a profoundly religious festival during which all forms of warfare were strictly and absolutely forbidden. To even contemplate marching an army during the Carnea was considered a heinous crime against the gods themselves, punishable by either immediate death or permanent exile. Consequently, the Spartan government firmly refused to mobilize its full forces. They instructed the other Greek city-states to simply wait for the arrival of the next full moon. But King Leonidas, with his keen strategic insight, instinctively knew that the Persians would never wait. He understood that if he slavishly adhered to the rigid letter of the law, the entirety of Greece would inevitably be consumed by flames. So, with cunning ingenuity, he sought and found a crucial loophole. While he was strictly prohibited from taking a full army, he was permitted to bring a personal bodyguard. Dispensing with the young, elite cadets who typically held such an esteemed honor, he instead hand-picked 300 older, seasoned veterans. For this fateful mission, he imposed only one single, stringent requirement, a poignant detail that unequivocally proves this was conceived as a suicide mission from its very inception. Every man he selected had to have a living son back in Sparta. Leonidas, in essence, wasn't merely assembling a tactical fighting unit. He was profoundly ensuring that when these brave men ultimately perished, their cherished family lines would not be extinguished along with them. When he bid farewell to his wife, Queen Gorgo, she did not implore him to return safely. Instead, she stoically requested his final orders. He did not utter words of affection like, "I love you." His poignant instruction was simply, "Marry a good man and have good children." In his mind, he was already gone. They then marched resolutely north to the fabled Hot Gates, a critically narrow pass where the towering mountains dramatically plunge into the sea. There, they joined a diverse coalition comprising approximately 7,000 other Greeks. This number might sound substantial until one truly comprehends the sheer magnitude of what was rapidly approaching. Xerxes was bringing forth the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history up to that pivotal point. Contemporary estimates now place its colossal size at around 200,000 soldiers. This was far more than a mere army. It was a colossal, moving city that was notorious for drinking entire rivers dry. They had traversed an immense distance, marching all the way from Asia, even crossing the vast ocean on an audacious bridge constructed entirely of boats. Now, this gargantuan force sat encamped on the plains of Trachis, their countless campfires transforming the distant horizon into a shimmering sea of light. Xerxes patiently waited for 4 agonizing days, absolutely convinced that the Greeks would flee in terror the moment they fully grasped the overwhelming disparity in numbers. Yet, the Greeks remained steadfast, completely unmoving. Frustrated and increasingly impatient, Xerxes dispatched a messenger to the Spartan line. The messenger offered no terms of surrender or negotiation. He simply gestured grandly toward the immense Persian army and delivered a concise, unequivocal command. "Lay down your weapons!" King Leonidas stood defiantly at the forefront of his 300 fathers. He delivered no lengthy speech. He engaged in no diplomatic negotiation. He simply bellowed back two powerful, immutable words that have come to define the very essence of the Spartan spirit. "Mol and Labe! Come and take them!" To truly grasp why Leonidas's audacious defiance was so utterly shocking, one must first comprehend precisely what colossal force he was yelling at. We often tend to visualize the Persian army in movies as a disorganized rabble of slaves relentlessly driven by whips. This cinematic depiction is a complete and utter fabrication. The formidable force staring down the Spartans was, in reality, the most sophisticated, extraordinarily wealthy, and technologically advanced military machine the world had ever witnessed. Herodotus, the venerable Greek historian, sensationally claimed that Xerxes brought over 2 million men, and that whenever they paused for lunch, they would metaphorically drink entire rivers dry. While modern historians have convincingly debunked the fantastical claim of millions, the actual reality was almost equally terrifying. Most reliable estimates now settle around 200,000 combat troops, supplemented by a truly massive train of support staff. In 480 BC, this was not merely an army, it was a migrating supercity, a living entity larger than the combined populations of almost every Greek city-state. Moving a force of this unimaginable size demanded a level of logistical planning that bordered on sheer magic. For years. That is precisely how long King Xerxes meticulously spent preparing for this monumental invasion. He didn't merely march his forces, he literally reshaped the very geography of the earth to perfectly fit his strategic needs. When his immense fleet encountered a treacherous peninsula at Mount Athos, a notorious location where a previous Persian fleet had been catastrophically destroyed by violent storms, Xerxes, unwilling to risk another disaster, did not hesitate. He imperiously ordered his engineers to excavate a canal directly through the land. They carved a navigable shipping lane through solid rock and sand for an astonishing mile and a half, solely to spare his navy the perilous necessity of sailing around a dangerous headland. Then there was the Hellespont, the notoriously narrow strait that geographically separates Asia from Europe. Xerxes, with unparalleled ambition, constructed 2 colossal pontoon bridges, meticulously tying nearly 700 warships together with flax and papyrus cables so extraordinarily thick they reputedly weighed as much as massive tree trunks. He then paved the decks with wood and soil, a clever stratagem to prevent his horses from looking down at the water and panicking. He quite literally walked his sprawling empire across the ocean. This, then, was the awe-inspiring power of Persian logistics. They had established vast supply depots meticulously staged all along the Thracian coast, systematically stockpiling millions of pounds of grain years in advance. They were, without exaggeration, an unstoppable industrial force. However, this very massive size was simultaneously Xerxes's greatest inherent weakness. A force of 200,000 men inherently creates a rapidly ticking clock. They consumed food and water at a truly staggering rate that is difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend, hundreds of tons of wheat and thousands of gallons of water every single day. The land they traversed simply could not sustain them indefinitely. Xerxes, therefore, couldn't simply besiege Thermopylae and patiently wait for the Spartans to starve, because his own gargantuan army would inevitably starve first. He was compelled to keep moving, to constantly break through. This critical logistical reality casts the Battle of Thermopylae in an entirely new, illuminating light. It was not merely a brutal clash of swords, it was, fundamentally, a desperate clash of time itself. Leonidas didn't necessarily need to annihilate every single Persian soldier. He simply needed to stop the clock. Every precious hour the Spartans valiantly held the pass was another hour the colossal Persian beast grew hungrier, thirstier, and exponentially more desperate. Xerxes understood this terrifying calculus. Sitting imperiously on his golden throne, watching that tiny, defiant line of Greeks obstruct his multinational steamroller, He must have been consumed by a volatile mix of seething rage and gnawing anxiety. He possessed the overwhelming numbers. He commanded unparalleled engineering prowess. And he believed, with unshakable conviction, that he held the God-given right to rule. Yet, he was utterly stuck in a bottleneck. He furiously ordered the assault. He did not, however, send his elite troops first. Instead, he dispatched the Medes and the Scythians, conscripted soldiers drawn from the far-flung fringes of his vast empire. Many were lightly armored, carrying flimsy wicker shields and wielding short spears. They were undoubtedly brave men, but they were about to be fed directly into a brutal meat grinder, a killing machine designed specifically to utterly destroy them. The massive Persian Ocean was about to funnel into a constricted space no wider than a country lane. The intricate logistics that had brought them there no longer mattered. The astounding engineering feats were irrelevant. The immense wealth held no sway. Now, it was purely a matter of geometry. Leonidas had not chosen this battlefield by mere accident. In the ancient world, geography was, quite literally, destiny, and Thermopylae stood as a masterpiece of defensive selection. In Greek, Thermopylae aptly means the Hot Gates. This evocative name derives from the natural sulfur springs that perpetually bubbled up from the foot of the mountains, filling the air with the pervasive, acrid smell of rotten eggs and thick steam. To the superstitious soldiers marching inexorably toward it, the pass must have looked and smelled disconcertingly like the very entrance to the underworld. But from a purely strategic standpoint, it was an unparalleled choke point. In 480 BC, the coastline differed significantly from its modern configuration. Back then, alluvial sediment had not yet pushed the sea back. The pass was incredibly narrow, a mere strip of land brutally sandwiched between the sheer, vertical limestone cliffs of Mount Kallidromos on one side and the Malian Gulf on the other. At the middle gate, the precise point where the Greeks had meticulously rebuilt the old Phocian wall, the passage was a mere 50 feet wide. This unassuming 50-foot stretch of earth stands as the pivotal, silent protagonist of our story. It is the fundamental reason the battle transpired at all. In military theory, this is termed a force multiplier. It rendered irrelevant the fact that Xerxes commanded 200,000 men. It mattered not that he possessed cavalry, chariots, and archers. In a space so extraordinarily narrow, a massive army is utterly paralyzed. The Persians could not flank the Greeks. They could not surround them. They could not utilize their overwhelming superior numbers to simply overwhelm the line. They were forced to come head-on, in a constricted column, funneling their vast ocean of soldiers into a tiny, desperate stream. This critical reality meant that at the actual point of contact, the odds were not 200,000 against 7,000. They were, instead, roughly 100 Persians against 100 Greeks. And in such a fair, man-to-man fight, Leonidas confidently liked his odds. This brings us directly to the extraordinary men who stood resolutely behind that protective wall. While popular legend predominantly focuses on the iconic 300 Spartans, we must, in fairness, give credit where it is truly due. Leonidas was, in fact, commanding a diverse and courageous coalition. Standing shoulder to shoulder with the Spartans were approximately 7,000 other Greeks. There were men from Tegea, Mantinea, Corinth, and Phocis. There were 400 Thebans, whose loyalty, it must be noted, was somewhat questionable, and 700 Thespians, who would ultimately prove themselves to be among the bravest warriors in recorded history. Leonidas, with astute tactical foresight, organized them into a rotating system. The Spartans, ever formidable, would take the front, enduring the deadliest position, and then cycle out to allow their allies to fight, thereby keeping the front line consistently fresh and effective. They locked their massive shields together, creating an impenetrable wall of gleaming bronze and sturdy wood that stretched across the entire width of the pass. The Persians, observing from a distance, beheld this formidable wall. They saw the distinctive red cloaks of the Spartans, a color purposefully chosen so that the sight of blood would not easily show. They heard the rhythmic, chilling chanting of the paeans, ancient battle hymns dedicated to Apollo. Xerxes, with a decisive gesture, gave the signal. The first wave of Medes and Scythians surged forward. They ran with a primal shout, a chaotic, terrifying roar clearly intended to intimidate the enemy. But the Greeks remained utterly silent. They did not charge. They simply stood there, knees slightly bent, shields immovably interlocked, spears rigidly leveled. The Persians slammed into the Greek line with the devastating force of a catastrophic car crash. The ensuing sound was utterly deafening, the sharp crack of splintering wood, the piercing scream of metal grating on metal, and the sickening crunch of bodies being brutally crushed by the sheer momentum of the surging crowd behind them. But the line, incredibly, did not break. The ingenious geography held firm. The Hot Gates had, in effect, irrevocably closed. The collision at the Hot Gates was not a battle in the conventional sense of individual duels. It was, rather, a scene of industrial-scale slaughter. To truly comprehend why the Persians were being butchered with such terrifying efficiency, we must examine the fundamental engineering of the two opposing armies. This was a conflict between two diametrically opposed military philosophies, one championing speed and mobility, the other emphasizing crushing weight and unwavering discipline. The Persians were meticulously designed for the expansive, open plains of Asia. They were light, exceptionally fast, and heavily relied on their skilled archers to soften up the enemy before closing in for the kill. Their armor consisted of quilted linen or intricate fish-scale iron sewn onto leather. Their shields were crafted from wicker, woven branches strong enough to deflect an arrow but tragically useless against a heavy, crushing strike. Their spears were short, and their swords were more akin to daggers. They were expertly built to chase down fleeing enemies, not to relentlessly crack open a heavily armored, metallic shell. The Greeks, and particularly the Spartans, were engineered for one brutal purpose: the collision. They were hoplites, named after the hoplon, a massive, concave shield meticulously crafted from wood and covered in a thin, resilient layer of bronze. It weighed a formidable nearly 20 pounds. When a Spartan stood in his disciplined formation, his shield provided crucial protection not only for his own left side but also for the entire right side of the man standing immediately next to him. This interlocking, synergistic design meant that the phalanx was only as strong as the unbreakable bond between the men who formed it. If even one man dared to run, the entire wall would instantly fracture. But Spartans, by their very nature and training, did not run. As the Medes crashed headlong into this formidable wall, they rapidly discovered the terrifying, unforgiving geometry of the phalanx. The Spartans were fighting with the dory, a formidable spear ranging from 7 to 9 feet in length. The Persian weapons, by stark contrast, were significantly shorter. The result was a mathematical certainty: the Persians were perishing before they could even get within striking distance of the Greeks. Imagine yourself on that harrowing front line of the Persian attack. You are relentlessly pushing forward, driven by the immense weight of thousands of men behind you, yet you remain utterly unable to reach your elusive enemy. All you perceive is an impenetrable wall of bronze shields, devoid of any discernible gaps. And from within that unyielding wall, row upon relentless row of spear points are stabbing forward with the rhythmic, cold precision of a sewing machine. You desperately grab a spear's shaft, attempting to break it, but the Spartan, with chilling efficiency, simply switches to the secondary weapon attached to the other end of the spear, the sauroder, or lizard killer, a bronze spike grimly used to finish off the wounded on the ground. The Spartans weren't merely killing, they were coldly managing the growing pile of corpses. Their efficiency was a blend of brutal coldness and robotic precision. As the Persian bodies rapidly stacked up, they themselves became a formidable obstacle. The Greeks, with relentless determination, would step forward, deliberately pushing the dead and the dying with their shields, quite literally paving the ground with their enemies to maintain their crucial footing. This was the Othismos, the Great Shove. It bore no resemblance to the cinematic, individual duels we often see in movies. It was, instead, a brutal, claustrophobic rugby scrum of death. The back rows of the phalanx inexorably pushed into the front rows, driving the bronze wall forward with the unstoppable force of a bulldozer. The pressure exerted was so incredibly intense that men on the front lines could be crushed to death without ever being directly struck by a weapon. The very breath was squeezed from their lungs, ribs were snapped by the overwhelming weight of the collective mass. For the Persians, it was an unimaginable nightmare. Their flimsy wicker shields shattered instantly under the devastating impact of the heavy Greek spears. Their short swords proved utterly incapable of penetrating the solid bronze breastplates of the Spartans. They were fighting phantoms, faceless warriors hidden behind their formidable metal helms, who never spoke, never screamed, and never, ever stopped stabbing. Herodotus vividly tells us that Xerxes, observing this horrifying spectacle from his opulent golden throne on a nearby hill, sprang to his feet 3 times in sheer terror. He was not fearful for his own life. He was terrified because his entire worldview was rapidly collapsing around him. He was the king of kings, his army was deemed invincible, and yet he was witnessing his elite soldiers being threshed like mere wheat. By the afternoon, the first wave was utterly broken. The Medes and Scythians retreated in disarray, leaving thousands of their dead piled high in the narrow pass. The ground was slick with fresh blood. The air hung thick with the metallic scent of gore and the pervasive sulfur of the hot springs. The Spartans, with grim satisfaction, cleaned their blades. They drank water. They rotated their lines with practiced ease. They hadn't even unleashed their full brutality yet. They knew this initial wave was merely a warm-up. They knew Xerxes would not tolerate this insult lightly. They looked up the pass and once again saw the ominous dust rising. The king was done sending the amateurs. He was now sending the immortals. As the sun began its slow dip on that first bloody day, an eerie hush descended upon the Persian lines. The broken remnants of the Medes were laboriously dragged away, and the battlefield was cleared of the most gruesome debris. From the sprawling Persian camp, a new, far more ominous sound emerged. It was not the chaotic shouting of the conscripts. It was the rhythmic, utterly disciplined marching of 10,000 men moving with chilling precision as one single, formidable organism. Xerxes was now playing his ultimate ace. He sent in the immortals. These were not merely soldiers. They were the terrifying elite of the empire, its most feared warriors. They earned the moniker, immortals, not because they were literally impervious to death, but because the strength of their unit was never, under any circumstances, allowed to drop below 10,000. If a man fell in battle, another immediately stepped up from the reserve to flawlessly take his place. To their enemies, it truly seemed as if they were battling a mythical hydra, a creature that could instantly regenerate its severed heads. They marched in absolute silence, their faces mysteriously obscured by cloth cowls that revealed nothing but their piercing eyes. They adorned themselves with gold jewelry beneath their robes, a clear sign of their extraordinarily high status, and they carried the finest weapons the vast Persian Empire could possibly produce. They were the emperor's personal shadows, the hardened men who had systematically conquered the known world. Xerxes settled back onto his throne, supremely confident that this new assault would be the decisive end of it all. The Spartans were undoubtedly tired, caked in gore, and showing signs of dehydration. The immortals, he believed, would simply walk over them. But as these elites inexorably closed in on the Hot Gates, they encountered the very same immutable physics problem that had so utterly destroyed the conscripts. The immortals were absolute masters of open-field maneuverability. They were rigorously trained to fluidly dance around an enemy, to expertly utilize flexibility and blinding speed. But inside the brutally confined pass, there was absolutely no room to dance. The Spartans, observing their approach, immediately recognized that these men posed a far greater danger. The immortals were heavier than the Medes, better armored with intricate iron scales beneath their vividly colorful tunics, but they still carried shorter spears and flimsy wicker shields. The crucial technological gap persisted. When these two elite forces savagely collided, the result was a brutal, grinding stalemate. The immortals, with suicidal bravery, threw themselves relentlessly at the bronze wall. They desperately grabbed the Spartan spears with their bare hands, attempting to snap the sturdy wood. They tried to crawl under the shields, hoping to hamstring the Greeks. But the phalanx, a meticulously engineered machine, was designed specifically to reject foreign objects. The Spartans stabbed, pushed, and inexorably stepped forward, their heavy shields brutally smashing into the faces of the Persian elite. Then, the Spartans executed a maneuver that, at first glance, appeared to be a catastrophic disaster. They broke. Suddenly, the Greek line shattered. The Spartans turned their backs and began to run in a panicked, seemingly disorganized mob toward the rear of the pass. The immortals, witnessing their seemingly invincible enemy finally routing, let out a thunderous roar of triumph. They instantly broke their own disciplined formation and charged forward with unbridled aggression to cut down the fleeing Greeks, abandoning their ranks in the thrilling heat of the chase. It was a cunning trap. This was a maneuver that demanded nerves of steel and an absolute, unwavering trust in their commander. Running away with your back exposed is, arguably, the most perilous action a soldier can undertake. But at a silent, prearranged signal, the fleeing Spartans abruptly planted their feet, spun around a full 180 degrees in perfect unison, and swiftly lowered their spears. The immortals, now a disorganized, pell-mell crowd running at full, desperate speed, ran straight into a fresh, unyielding wall of spear points. The ensuing slaughter was nothing short of catastrophic. The momentum of the Persian charge was devastatingly turned against them. Caught completely off balance, utterly out of formation, and unable to halt their headlong rush, they were impaled by the dozens. The Spartans butchered them with cold, mechanical efficiency. Astonishingly, this deadly deception happened not just once, but multiple times. The Spartans, with grim artistry, played with the immortals, expertly using their own aggression against them. It was a true masterclass in psychological warfare. They unequivocally proved that unwavering discipline, not overwhelming numbers, ultimately wins battles. By evening, the immortals were in full retreat, their morale shattered. The psychological impact on the Persian army was absolutely devastating. These were considered the gods of war, the untouchables, and they had been decisively beaten by a group of seemingly tired old men. That night, the mood in the vast Persian camp was funereal, heavy with gloom. Xerxes was no longer leaping from his throne in rage. He was paralyzed by profound indecision. He had thrown his sheer, brute mass at the Greeks, and it had failed spectacularly. He had thrown his absolute best elites at the Greeks, and they too had failed. He was rapidly running out of viable options. But while the Spartans celebrated their impossible, hard-won victory, cleaning their wounds and consuming their meager rations, a quiet tragedy was simultaneously unfolding in the deepening darkness high above them. The Greeks had definitively won the battle of tactics, but they were tragically about to lose the crucial battle of information. A local man, Ephialtes, was making his treacherous way to the Persian camp. He was neither a mighty warrior nor a seasoned general. He was merely a shepherd, and he carried a secret that, in that moment, was worth more than 100,000 soldiers combined. He knew a way around the impregnable wall. History often pivots on the smallest, most unassuming of hinges. For 2 grueling days, the entire, overwhelming might of the Persian Empire had been held at bay by a mere few thousand men and a brilliantly chosen piece of geography. Xerxes was utterly humiliated. His officers were gripped by a palpable terror of his inevitable wrath. The ambitious invasion of Europe was stalling before it had even truly begun. But in the deepening shadows of the vast Persian camp, a man arrived who would irrevocably alter the very fate of the Western world. His name was Ephialtes. In popular culture, Ephialtes is often sensationally depicted as a deformed monster, a pathetic hunchback cruelly rejected by Spartan society. This, however, is a purely dramatic invention. The historical reality is far more mundane and, in a strange way, far more disturbing. Ephialtes was a local Greek, a humble Trachinian shepherd. He was not a monster, he was simply a man who craved money. He observed the brutal slaughter at the Hot Gates, noted the desperation etched onto the face of the great king, and instantly recognized a lucrative business opportunity. He approached Xerxes' generals and revealed to them precisely what they had been fervently praying for. There existed a back door, a secret passage high in the mountains above Thermopylae. There was an ancient goat track, known as the Anapeia path. It wound precariously through the dense forests of Mount Kallidromos and descended stealthily behind the Spartan wall. It was undeniably steep, notoriously difficult, and cunningly hidden by thick oak forests, but it was, critically, passable. For a hefty bag of gold, Ephialtes offered to guide the Persians through the treacherous darkness. Xerxes did not hesitate for a single moment. Under the clandestine cover of night, he detached the immortals, the very same men who had been so humiliatingly repelled just hours earlier, and dispatched them up the mountain. Imagine the suffocating tension of that arduous climb. Thousands of Persian soldiers moving in the absolute pitch black, guided by a treacherous local. The path itself was thickly covered in dry oak leaves. Herodotus provides us with a chilling auditory detail. The air was so utterly still that the sound of thousands of feet crunching on the dry leaves resonated like a roaring wind sweeping through the trees. High up on the mountain, Leonidas, anticipating precisely such a flanking maneuver, had strategically stationed 1,000 Phocian hoplites to guard this exact route. These men were intended to be the cork in the bottle. If they steadfastly held the path, the Spartans below would remain safe. But as the Phocians heard the ominous crunching of leaves and saw the flickering torches of the immortals emerging from the dense woods, they made a catastrophic mistake. The Phocian commander, witnessing the massive Persian column, mistakenly assumed the immortals were advancing to attack them directly. Panicked, the Phocians retreated from the narrow path to the top of a nearby hill, forming a defensive circle to make their last, desperate stand. They prepared to die, fighting bravely for their homeland. But the Persians, with their singular objective, simply did not care about them. The Persian commander, Hydarnes, saw the path open up before him. He ordered his archers to fire a few volleys of arrows to keep the Phocians pinned down, and then simply marched his army directly past them. He ignored the Phocians completely. It was a tactical blunder of epic proportions. By retreating to what they perceived as a better defensive position, the Phocians had inadvertently thrown open the very door to Greece. They stood on their hill, weapons ready, watching in utter horror as the immortals streamed past them, disappearing down the trail toward the distant sea, inexorably moving toward the rear of the Spartan line. Down below, in the faint pre-dawn light, the camp runners rushed breathlessly to Leonidas's tent. The news they carried was grim, chilling. The seers, having examined the entrails of the latest sacrifice, had grimly predicted death. Lookouts burst in, pale and gasping for air. "The Persians are behind us!" The pincer movement had irrevocably closed. The very geography that had been their greatest weapon had just been catastrophically turned against them. The hot gates were no longer a shield, they were now, unmistakably, a tomb. Dawn, day 3. The air was cold, but the news that permeated the camp was infinitely colder. Scouts came stumbling into the Greek encampment, breathless and pale, confirming the worst: the immortals were descending the mountain. The trap had snapped shut with merciless finality. Leonidas called a final council of war. He looked intently at the faces of his allies, men from Corinth, Arcadia, and Mycenae. They had fought with unwavering bravery, but now, staying meant certain, unavoidable death. Leonidas then did something that unequivocally proves he was a brilliant strategist, far more than just a mere warrior. He did not demand that they die alongside him. Instead, he ordered them to leave. He knew, with absolute clarity, that Greece would desperately need every sword for the far greater battles that were yet to come. There was simply no point in foolishly throwing away 7,000 precious lives when 300, or perhaps a few more, would serve the same grim purpose of defiance. He told them to retreat south, to regroup, to protect their cherished cities. But Leonidas himself could not possibly leave. Spartan law was explicit, immutable. Retreat was simply not an option. A Spartan king did not run. Moreover, there was a solemn prophecy from the oracle of Delphi, delivered months earlier. Either your glorious city will be sacked by the Persians, or the Lacedaemonians will mourn the death of a king. Leonidas, with profound resolve, chose to be the ultimate sacrifice that would save his beloved city. However, the history books and the dramatic movies often abruptly stop there. They tell us, quite simply, that 300 Spartans stood alone. This, I contend, is the greatest injustice of the Thermopylae legend. When the dust of the retreating allies finally settled, Leonidas looked around and profoundly realized that he was not, in fact, alone. 700 men from the city of Thespi, bravely led by their general, Demophilus, steadfastly refused to obey the order to retreat. We must pause here to truly appreciate the extraordinary courage of the Thespians. The Spartans were meticulously bred for war. They were fulfilling a lifetime of intense indoctrination. The Thespians, by stark contrast, were not. They were ordinary citizens, humble farmers, and skilled craftsmen. They had no binding law forcing them to stay. They had no ancient prophecy guiding their fate. Their city was certainly not safe behind the protective Spartan peninsula. It lay directly in the devastating path of the advancing Persian army. By choosing to stay, they were essentially guaranteeing that their cherished hometown would be utterly burned to the ground. Yet they stayed. They chose to stand and valiantly die beside the Spartans, simply because they believed, with unshakable conviction, that it was the morally right thing to do. There were also 400 Thebans, though history remains divided on whether they stayed as true volunteers or as reluctant hostages, kept to ensure Thebes' loyalty. And we must never forget the Helots, the Spartan servants and light infantry, who undoubtedly stood and died in the hundreds, unrecorded and often forgotten by history. So, it was not merely 300 against the world. It was, more accurately, roughly 1,500 men facing an unimaginable human tsunami. As the sun majestically rose, the grim realization settled over the entire camp. There would be no rotations today, no precious relief, no chance for sleep. Leonidas gathered his men. He offered them no false hope. He promised no miraculous escape. Instead, he offered them stark, unwavering clarity. According to enduring legend, he turned to his comrades and delivered one of the most utterly badass lines in all of military history. He didn't tell them to pray. He told them to eat. Eat a good breakfast, men, for tonight we dine in Hades. It was a grim joke, a dark, profound acceptance of their brutal reality. They weren't fighting for mere survival anymore. They were fighting for the body count. The objective had shifted from simply holding the path to inflicting maximum, unforgettable trauma on the enemy's psyche. They wanted to make the Persians pay such an astronomically high price for these last few yards of hallowed dirt that they would never, ever forget the name of Sparta. The shields were tightened. The last precious drops of water were shared. The 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians, and the 400 Thebans turned resolutely to face the colossal Persian ocean one final, desperate time. On the third day, the sun rose on a vastly different kind of army. The Spartans and Thespians now knew, with absolute certainty, that they were completely surrounded. The tactical game was definitively over. There was no longer any need to meticulously hold the line or carefully conserve energy. There was only one singular objective left: to take as many Persians with them as humanly possible before their inevitable end. Leonidas, with a final, desperate command, ordered his men to abandon the relative safety of the narrow Phocian wall. They bravely marched out into the wider part of the pass, a seemingly suicidal move that strategically allowed them to engage a greater number of enemies at once. They didn't wait for the Persians to attack. They charged. This was no longer a disciplined phalanx, it was a furious, desperate brawl. The Greeks crashed into the Persian lines with the unbridled fury of men who had already fully accepted their own deaths. They drove the Persians back relentlessly, toppling them into the sea, trampling them into the blood-soaked mud. Herodotus vividly tells us that the Persian commanders were forced to stand behind their own troops with brutal whips, mercilessly lashing them to force them forward against these terrifying Greek demons. In this initial, furious charge, the inevitable, tragic happened. Leonidas, king of Sparta, was struck down. In Hollywood, the hero typically dies last, often alone, after delivering a dramatic, poignant monologue. History, however, is rarely so kind. Leonidas likely perished early in this final, desperate skirmish, pierced by a barrage of Persian arrows or spears, but his death ignited the most intense and furious moment of the entire battle. In ancient Greek warfare, the body of a king was considered sacred. To lose it to the enemy was a profound disgrace, far worse than any military defeat. A furious, visceral struggle immediately erupted over his fallen corpse. It was a scene ripped directly from the pages of the Iliad. The Spartans, witnessing their beloved king fall, surged forward with renewed, desperate fervor. They did not fight for ground, they fought, with every fiber of their being, for his body. 4 times the Persians bravely attempted to drag him away. And 4 times the Greeks, with impossible tenacity, drove them back, savagely hacking through piles of enemy dead to retrieve their fallen leader. Against all conceivable odds, they succeeded. They painstakingly dragged Leonidas back to their lines, a final, poignant act of loyalty to the man who had unflinchingly led them to hell itself. But their weapons were now failing them. The heavy, formidable spears, the dory, had shattered long ago. The men then drew their xiphos, short, leaf-shaped iron swords meticulously designed for close-quarters butchery. They hacked until the blades dulled or snapped. And then, the most chilling and primal phase of the battle commenced. Herodotus pens a sentence that continues to haunt historians to this very day. When their spears were broken and their swords were gone, the Spartans and Thespians continued to fight with their hands and their teeth. They were literally tearing at the invaders like rabid, cornered wild animals. It was a display of primal, naked, horrifying violence. They were savagely punching armored men, brutally strangling them with bare hands, and fiercely biting into throats. It was a raw display of ferocity that utterly terrified the Persians. Even with their overwhelming numbers, the Persians began to hesitate, their charges faltering. They were too afraid to get close to these unarmed, blood-soaked madmen. Slowly, inexorably, the sheer weight of numbers pushed the few surviving Greeks back. They retreated one last time, past the wall, to a small hillock known today as Colonus Hill. There, they formed a small, desperate, tight circle. The immortals arrived from the rear, finally sealing the trap with grim finality. The Greeks were now completely, irrevocably surrounded. Xerxes, having witnessed enough of this horrific carnage, didn't want to lose any more of his precious men in brutal hand-to-hand combat against these monstrous opponents. He ordered his army to pull back. The archers stepped forward, thousands upon thousands of them. They raised their bows in unison and, with a terrifying collective release, blotted out the sun itself. The end, for these valiant men, didn't come with a thunderous bang. It came with a chilling whisper, the soft, ominous sound of thousands of arrows falling like relentless rain. The last Spartans and Thespians did not die fighting in individual glory. They died huddled together, buried beneath an inescapable storm of iron. When the last bowstrings finally snapped and the suffocating dust slowly settled, a heavy, profound silence fell over the pass. The Hot Gates were at last open, but the price of admission had been truly astronomical. On the small mound of Colonus Hill, the bodies of the last defenders were so thickly covered in arrows that they presented the macabre sight of a strange, bristling forest. This is not merely a poetic description. In 1939, archaeologists excavating that exact hill unearthed thousands of bronze Persian arrowheads buried deep in the soil. You can still witness them in museums today, twisted, corroded bits of metal that serve as tangible, physical proof of the iron storm that definitively ended the Spartan resistance. Xerxes himself walked through the desolate battlefield. The gruesome sight must have turned his stomach. While he had technically won, he had lost an estimated 20,000 men to a force that was a mere fraction of his own colossal size. Among the fallen were two of his own royal brothers and many of the empire's highest-ranking nobles. Herodotus recounts that Xerxes was so utterly terrified of his own army grasping the true scale of the disaster that he ordered a massive, clandestine cover-up. He had deep trenches dug and quickly buried the vast majority of his own dead, leaving only about 1,000 visible, in a cynical attempt to trick the rest of his fleet into believing the victory had been easily won. It was, arguably, the first recorded instance of military propaganda spin in the annals of history. But his true, seething fear and incandescent rage were reserved for one singular man. When the Persian soldiers finally identified the body of Leonidas from the gruesome pile of corpses, they conveyed the news to the king. In Persian culture, bravery was highly revered and praised. Typically, a valiant enemy king would be treated with honor, his body reverently returned or buried with appropriate rites. Xerxes had, in the past, shown respect to other captured enemies, but not this time. The 3 days of agonizing humiliation, the tragic loss of his own brothers, and the shattering of his aura of invincibility had profoundly broken something within Xerxes. He ordered Leonidas's head to be brutally cut off and his body to be crucified, impaled on a stake for all to see. This was a shocking, egregious violation of both religious law and international custom, a profound taboo. By savagely mutilating the body, Xerxes was not displaying strength, he was, in fact, revealing an undeniable, infantile weakness. It was a petty tantrum. He was desperately attempting to kill the enduring legend of the man because he could not, in his deepest heart, defeat his unconquerable spirit. As the formidable Persian army prepared to march south toward Athens, leaving the headless body of the Spartan king to rot in the sun, a terrifying realization began to spread like wildfire through the ranks. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king, had famously warned Xerxes before the battle. Now Xerxes, his face etched with anxiety, posed a chilling question. How many more of them are there? Demaratus, looking upon the carnage, upon the fallen immortals, replied with grim finality. There are many great cities in Greece, but there is one called Sparta, and in that city there are 8,000 more men just like these. The color must have drained from Xerxes's face. He had spent days and sacrificed 20,000 lives to kill 300. The mathematical implication was utterly terrifying. If he had to fight 8,000 of them, he wouldn't have an army left to conquer anything. The Battle of Thermopylae was, by its very definition, a tactical defeat for the Greeks. The road to Athens was undeniably open. The city would, indeed, burn. But strategically and psychologically, the Persians had already lost. They were no longer marching as triumphant conquerors. They were marching as men who now knew, with bone-chilling certainty, that they could bleed. A few months after the brutal slaughter, a simple stone pillar was erected at the hallowed site of the battle. It bore an inscription, penned by the esteemed poet Simonides, a couplet so simple, yet so haunting, that it has been memorized by countless soldiers for 2,500 years. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Thermopylae was, by definition, a defeat. The pass was tragically lost. Athens was captured and burned to the ground. If the story had ended there, Leonidas would be nothing more than a historical footnote, a foolish king who senselessly threw away his life. But the story did not end there. The 3 precious days bought by the heroic 300 were, arguably, the most expensive and consequential time in all of history. They bought just enough time for the Athenians to successfully evacuate their city and for the Greek fleet to strategically regroup. A few weeks later, at the pivotal Battle of Salamis, the Greeks, with cunning naval tactics, decisively broke the back of the formidable Persian navy. And 1 year later, at the monumental Battle of Plataea, the prophetic warning of Demaratus finally came true. The Spartans, at last, fully mobilized. They didn't send 300 men, they sent thousands. Led by Pausanias, the nephew of Leonidas, the full, devastating might of the Spartan war machine smashed the Persian army into the dust. The invasion was utterly over. The profound sacrifice at the Hot Gates didn't just save a country, it preserved an idea. It safeguarded the fragile, nascent experiment of Greek democracy, its unparalleled art, and its profound philosophy, the very foundations of what we now proudly call Western civilization. If the Spartans had run, if they had taken the easy, cowardly way out, the world we inhabit today might look unimaginably different. We remember them not simply because they won a battle, but because they showed us the ultimate, enduring definition of freedom. Freedom, they demonstrated, isn't just about living without chains. It's the profound ability to look at overwhelming odds, to stare certain death directly in the face, and still possess the unyielding will to say, no. When Leonidas famously shouted, "Molin Labe! Come and take them!" he wasn't just defiantly talking about his weapons. He was talking about his intrinsic dignity. He was articulating that there are things far more valuable than life itself. Today, a striking modern statue of Leonidas stands proudly at Thermopylae. Underneath his bronze feet, those 2 immortal words are still powerfully carved in stone, a stark warning to tyrants, a sacred promise to the free. Molin Labe! Come and take them! If you've diligently stuck with me until the very end of this immersive journey, you are undeniably someone who deeply values the rich, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our shared past. If this compelling story resonated with you, please ensure you are subscribed and have the bell notification icon thoughtfully turned on. I have a wealth of even more forgotten history eager to uncover with you. And before you depart, I have a thought-provoking question for you to consider and answer in the comments below. In our contemporary world, where safety is frequently prioritized above all else, do you genuinely believe the Spartan mindset still holds a relevant place, or is it merely a dangerous relic of a violent, bygone era? I'll be eagerly reading your insightful thoughts there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next captivating chapter.